I want to start with really by saying and paying tribute to the many Iranian activists that I've spoken to for preparing for this meeting. They really ought to be the ones who are speaking here tonight because I've learnt a huge amount from them. But also, actually, we have to recognise that it would be extremely unsafe for many of them to be here speaking in public and showing their solidarity with people who have taken to the streets in protest against a brutal regime in Iran. I'm saying that because also in the context where we've seen the internet shut down and where there is often very little connection between activism on the ground in Iran and the Palestine Solidarity Movement or the trade union movement in this country, it's very difficult to get information, and a lot of misinformation swirls about this issue. I want to be clear at the start that I see the uprising that has unfolded over the last few weeks as one stage in a long and organic crisis of the Iranian regime that has been in power since the revolution of 1979, or rather, more accurately, has been in power since Imam Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party consolidated power after the revolution of 1979, which was a great popular revolution, one which raised many demands around social justice as well as liberation and to get rid of the tyranny of the Shah, raised anti-imperialist demands, and began to point the way towards possibilities for a much more equal and just and democratic Iran. Those hopes were actually, I would argue, crushed by the consolidation of the regime that Khomeini set up. So I want to make that clear as a starting point that this is likely to be another stage in a long-running revolutionary process. Whether it succeeds as a revolution and whether it becomes the kind of revolution that I think would embody the hopes that many ordinary Iranians would put in it is another question, and that's one of the things I hope we can come to discuss inside in the Q&A part, and to hear people's views on that. It's also clear that we've seen over the last few weeks, waves of protests that have really given desperation that many people in Iran are feeling as a result of the combination both of the impact of economic crisis, which is in many ways is down to the impact in the first place of the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran by the US government, but also it is a crisis that takes the form as well of has a political dimension. When we look at the waves of protests and uprisings that we've seen periodically over the last few years, one of the very strong patterns that we see is the way in which those have moved between revolts that have been triggered over economic crisis. For one example of these is the revolt that took place in 2019 that was triggered by the lack of access to affordable fuel, for example, and the economic crisis and unemployment that was gripping in particular, perhaps more peripheral areas in Iran rather than so much in the capital city, Tehran. Whereas a few years later, in 2022, we saw an uprising that had a very firmly political focus and was one actually centered around the question of oppression, in particular, the institutional misogyny and sexism of the Islamic Republic and the way in which young women's bodies were used as a theatre of oppression by the police through the enforcement of the so-called mandatory hijab laws. It was triggered by the murder by the police of a young woman, Gina Armani, who is also known as Mahsa Armani, who was young Kurdish woman who was beaten to death by the police for allegedly wearing her mandatory hijab, her head covering, improperly. And this triggered a wave of protests which sped across Iran, not only in the Kurdish area where she originated, but into Tehran, into Baluchistan, which is in the southeastern corner of Iran, and became a rallying point for a whole set of demands, including to the level of calling for the regime to fall itself. So in the last few years alone, we've seen repeated examples of uprisings driven by anger of ordinary people with the way in which their lives are curtailed by this regime. But then, if we go back to the previous decade, to 2009, we saw another round of protests, which in fact was triggered by questions of democracy. In 2009, the so-called Green Movement, which focused on the leadership of reformist politicians and centered around the question of the elections, and the main slogan of which was "Where is my vote?" brought actually millions of people onto the streets. Some estimates were as high as 3 million people demonstrated under that slogan, "Where is my vote?" in 2009, and also met actually a very repressive response from the regime. And I would argue that, again, that's another staging post in this process of long-running crisis for the regime. But we can't understand what's going on inside Iran, I would argue, by simply looking at it from the crisis internal to the Islamic Republic. Actually, you have to look at it in the context of imperialism in the wider region. And I would argue that there are two key aspects here that we need to bear in mind. First is changes in the overall way in which imperialism works in terms of the balance between the largest powers at a global level. And that we've seen since over the last few decades, the relative decline of the US as the most powerful imperialist power on the planet. And in fact, one of the staging posts in that process was the catastrophe that overcame the US as a result of its ill-fated invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the US occupied Iraq, went in and removed Saddam Hussein's government from power, and faced massive popular resistance, faced an armed uprising that eventually forced the US to have to reconquer Iraq all over again. This was a blow to the US's ability to influence what happened on a regional scale. It didn't remove the US as a major power in the region, but it presented a setback from which the Iranian regime actually benefited, and Iran was able to intervene in Iraq over the subsequent years and help to build up a regional presence through alliances, not only with, for example, Shia Islamist parties in Iraq, but also through a long-standing alliance with the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and through relationships with, for example, the Lebanese Shia Islamist movement Hezbollah. I would argue that although this alliance was predicated on the fact that the Iranian regime was opposed to the US, it was an antagonist of the US, and therefore also included reaching out and military support for Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas. It was focused on the interests of the Iranian regime itself. It wasn't based on a strategy that could have helped push the region towards liberation from US imperialism. Nevertheless, it was for a number of years, relatively successful strategy pursued by the Islamic Republic's leadership to assert itself in regional affairs. Yet, if you remember, the point that I just made was that the US faced a number of challenges to its power in the region. This created a space, I would argue, in which other regional powers, including allies of the US, key allies of the US, like the Israeli state, were able to assert themselves more forcefully. And in fact, it accelerated the competition between those regional powers and the Iranian regime. One of the outcomes of that process, I would argue as well, has been the horrors of the genocide in Gaza, that the horrific numbers of people killed by Israeli forces in Gaza were partially, of course, about the genocidal nature of the Israeli regime itself, by, in particular, the role played by the far right parties, Zionist parties that have agitated for genocide. But it also was a message to Iran, to the Iranian leadership, about Israel's desire to assert itself on a regional basis. And that what we've seen unfold over since 2023 has been the playing out of that process on a regional level. This has meant that the Iranian regime has faced actually very significant challenges both at home and abroad at the same time. And these interplay between the regional and the domestic context is absolutely critical to understanding and analysing why it is that now it faces one of its greatest challenges. There were a few questions that asked about has the US in some way captured the movement on the ground? Is the regime presenting this as a foreign-led movement? I mean, I very much agree with the Iranian comrades who spoke that it's a mischaracterization to think of the movement of the ground as being somehow a puppet of the US, or even of being a puppet of Iranian figure like Reza Pahlavi, who has called out for some of the protests, and whose name has been spoken on some of the protests. So I think it is important to recognise that there is an echo for example, of the calls for restoration of the monarchy on some of the protests, but that doesn't mean that everybody in those protests has a worked out view that they want to restore the Pahlavi dynasty. Information is hard to come by, but eyewitness accounts that I've read of protests in Tehran have said that there has been a variety of slogans and protests. One of the popular ones that has been heard and was one of the slogans that was in the during the Jina uprising, the Woman Life Freedom uprising, was "Down with the oppressor, whether they're the dictator or whether they're the king." That's a very clear expression of an opposition to all forms of authoritarianism and oppression, and not trying to swap one kind of oppressive regime for another. Another account that I read, though, said that there were people in the protest were raising the name of Reza Pahlavi out of a sense of desperation, of feeling that there wasn't any alternative. And it does seem clear that one of the things that triggered the very violent response from the regime was after the protests seemed to be associated with the Reza Pahlavi's calls from exile for people to go into the streets, which I would say actually also underscores, in fact, the way in which he is prepared to use protesters on the streets in a way that actually exposes them to horrific danger, rather than actually offering any kind of leadership that would matter on the ground. I do take the point from Iranian comrades that it's absolutely up to the people of Iran how they decide what kind of system of government they want, and that foreign intervention should be opposed by everybody. There could be absolutely no truck, I think, if you are on the left, of saying that you are in favour of intervention. The only regime change that matters is the regime change that we do ourselves. But nevertheless, if I were in Iran, I would be utterly opposed to the restoration of an authoritarian monarchy, and would be organising in solidarity with those who want to see an expansion of democracy in Iran, and don't want to swap the IGRC for the return of SAVAK, which was a brutal political police during the Iranian monarchy. So I think it's really important to be clear about the political contradictions that have led to this situation, where some of the calls coming out from sections of the movement in Iran are inspired partially by quite right-wing forces. But again, that one of the things that the repression instituted by the sanctions has done is it has cut many Iranians off from the outside world. And one of the things that is absolutely clear from the experience of those kinds of sanctions regimes, they don't damage authoritarian regimes, they damage ordinary people, and they damage the resistance to those regimes. Again, this is clear from what I've understood from talking to trade unionist activists from Iran, that the workers' movement in Iran, there is a workers' movement on the ground in Iran, which has resisted the very neoliberal reforms that have been pushed by both reformist and more conservative politicians over successive years inside Iran. Massive privatizations, outsourcing and casualization of jobs, all of these things have taken place in ways that have hit wide layers of the working class, and have also played a factor in the impoverishment of many layers of the formerly middle class people who have fallen into poverty. Yes, some of that is absolutely about the geopolitical situation and sanctions, but there are also plenty of people at the top of the regime who have managed to maintain their standard of living. In terms of the class basis of the protests in the street, I think it's quite difficult to say at the moment accurately. But again, some reports that I've read have suggested that it's quite cross-class in terms of different layers of people from different generations out in the streets, which is a difference to some of the protests around the Woman Life Freedom uprising that have been more concentrated among younger people. There was a very good analysis that was of that uprising by the Iranian historian Peyman Jafari, where he argued that one of the problems with the Women Life Freedom uprising was that it didn't manage to really become a movement that had the organized working class at its heart, and that there was, in a sense, a kind of generational divide between layers of younger people who tended to lead the street protests and older layers, people who were rooted in workplaces as trade unionists and so on. And that is one of the issues going forward for developing a momentum behind this movement that goes beyond street protests. One of the things that I did when preparing for this meeting was to go and reread the history of the 1978 to 1979 revolution. One of the things that reminded me was that, in fact, the killings, the crackdown started in January 1978, and protests had been going on for 8, 9 months into like September, October 1978, before the movement really accelerated. And the point at which it accelerated was when mass strikes broke out in the oil industry, in other sectors, other industrial sectors, in from September into October. In particular, the escalation of the oil workers' strikes, and that transformed the movement. And I would argue it actually gave it a dynamic that was unstoppable in terms of breaking apart the existing state. It was the Shah imposed martial law, I think it was in October 1978, and didn't fall from power, in fact, until really early February. He left the country in January 1979, and then essentially, they was out of power by the beginning of February. I think that does raise real questions, in fact, for how is it that this could become a revolutionary movement that is able to address those questions that millions of Iranians are asking? How can they have a society that is more equal, more just, doesn't rely on oppression, whether it's oppression around nationality or around gender, and also starts to take on those questions about how can you build a more equal society through the redistribution of wealth. There's a really good question about what is it that we can do. Are sanctions on the IGRC, or something? What apart from American bombing? I mean, I would say that I wouldn't trust any government, particularly not the British government, that seems to think that holding up a piece of paper with a few words on it is a form of terrorism, should be allowed to designate anybody a terrorist. I think that the forms of action that that will be most effective will be ones that help to build the capacity of Iranians to resist themselves. So, like trade unions could be taking action to show their solidarity with comrades in Iran. Workers could be taking action to block the regime's access to repressive materials, to arms. We should be working with Iranian activists to try and develop ways to help build the movement and to build it from its capacity to resist from below, and to build those bonds of solidarity between people who are fighting against imperialism elsewhere in the region. To take up the question of the difference in terms of why is it people are going maybe hesitant to go into the streets? I agree with the comrades that highlighted the costs and the risks for people going into the streets in Iran at the moment after this massive wave of repression. But I think it is much too soon to say that the protest movement even in fact to decide whether this is going to really spiral into a much deeper rebellion or not. One of the things that will happen is that, of course, people will have to mourn and bury their dead. And in fact, one of the horrific things is that in some cases, people don't even know how many people in their families have been killed if they've been cut off from places around the country, for example. And as that becomes clear, that anger will start to build again. One of the traditions in Iran is to hold after 40 days a memorial for a person who's died, and that was part of the dynamic of the revolution in 78 to 79 was the 40-day mourning periods, and that also became political protests. This was also a feature of the Jina uprising and Women Life Freedom, where the 40-day commemoration for Jina Armani was a spur to the development of the movement. I think it's really important not to underestimate the scale of brutality that we've seen from the regime and how this is actually, that's a qualitative shift in terms of the level of killing that there is good evidence has taken place. Thousands of people are likely to have been killed and probably, and many thousands also injured, including people being shot in the eye and so on, deliberately targeted. There have also been, and this is something that where the Iranian regime has taken up similar tactics to the Assad regime in Syria, where they've mobilized their own supporters on the streets and have tried to paint the protests as being solely the work of foreigners or foreign governments, and to present them all as violent protests. And so they're one of the lessons I think that is exceedingly important to draw from the experience of, for example, the Syrian revolution and its ultimate defeat was how the working class, organized working class, and mass action by workers in their workplaces needed to play a really critical role in suppressing and containing that effort by regimes to mobilize people on their behalf. And when the tragedy of the Syrian revolution is actually that didn't take place at sufficient scale early on in the revolutionary process, so that the Assad regime was able to fill the streets of Damascus, for example, and Aleppo repeatedly with people praising the dictator, even while some of those people had been forced to do that by their bosses at work. They didn't believe it, but they were, and at night, for example, they were often involved in clandestine protests or going out into the streets themselves. If you contrast that with Egypt in 2011, in Egypt, the regime faced a mass popular uprising and it called on the trade union movement, had state-run trade unions that it tried to mobilize to support it, to come into the streets and beat up the people in Tahrir Square, and that completely failed. The Egyptian regime called for trade unionists to support it, and they said no. They refused to turn up. It had to rely on a motley crew of people with camels and a bunch of thugs who came and tried to smash up the protests in Tahrir Square, but it didn't bring out masses of ordinary people. And that's, again, where this question around workers' organisation is really important. And when we say workers here, we're not only talking about workers in industrial workplaces, but teachers, health workers. There have been big strikes by teachers and health workers in Iran quite recently. And, as well as workers in critical industries like the oil industry and so on. And I think that intervention can make a huge difference in terms of shaping the revolutionary potential of this movement. And as Tomasz said in the contribution and at the end, actually that provides a potential basis for building a movement that is very hard for imperialist powers to overcome. A movement of that character would have an echo across the region that people in Egypt, for example, would look to if the movement in Iran begins to develop some momentum, that starts to gain some successes. I mean, if they manage to push back the police or even force the release of political prisoners, those kind of things send a thrill of hope across the region. This even happened a year ago when Bashar al-Assad fell. Now, it was quite a complex situation. It was on the one hand the working out of the long delayed effect of the Syrian revolution, but also was partly it was a military operation as well by
1 minute.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and a military coup essentially led by an armed group. Nevertheless, when people saw the doors of Sednaya prison opening across the region, actually there were dictators, from Cairo, actually, I would argue to Tehran, were terrified at what that symbol of liberation meant. So that's one of the reasons why the more that a popular movement from below with organized workers at its heart can develop in Iran, the more that you have the potential for that to really provide a model of hope from across the region. There were, I think, a few other people who raised the issue about role of China, role of Russia. So obviously, the Iranian regime over the years has built quite important economic and military relationships with both China and Russia. For example, the Russian government supported the Assad regime in Syria. It was also a co-participant along with the Iranian regime in the crushing of the Syrian revolution and the horrific massacres that took place there. There are important economic relationships between Iran and China. Chinese investment is also present strongly in large areas of the Middle East. In fact, even in the Gulf, you have kind of interlayered US and Chinese investment. So it's certainly right that the kind of geopolitical competition between China and the US it plays itself out in these kind of circumstances. But I think that it's very unlikely that the Iranian regime can count on direct intervention by Russia or China in a way that would immediately counterbalance the US and Israel on the other side. One of the signals for that is actually, of course, what happened to the Assad regime is that all that the Russians were able to do essentially when Assad fell was to offer him a place to go into exile, and rather than being able to intervene and prop up his regime in a meaningful way. And neither were Iranian forces which were present in Syria able to do the same. So I think though that one of the areas that and this relates to some questions that were pointed out about the stance of other Arab states, particularly perhaps those in the Gulf, which, as I think comrades who contributed in the discussion rightly said, are not actually in favour of the collapse of the Iranian regime immediately, and were working to try and de-escalate the situation from the point of view of their own interests in order to try and better manage the situation. I think again, I agree with the people who commented saying that this emphasizes the way in which no ruling class likes to see a popular uprising take power, and that was also true in 1979. I want to make a really brief comment about the question of Islamism and sometimes called Islamic fundamentalism. I think it's important when discussing questions around Islamist movements to realize that they are often very varied. They can have quite contradictory composite class basis. They can include working class supporters. They're often led by people from the modern middle class. Sometimes they include elements of the modern bourgeoisie. Sometimes they include elements of older middle class or ruling class layers. So they're a mixture of things. And actually, some of their big slogans motivate people for all sorts of reasons. I don't think there's anything special about the language of Islam being used as a political language that is in any way very different to nationalist language being used to. It can be the calls that attracted people to Khomeini's movement were when he spoke about we need to fight oppression, we need to stand up against imperialism, the oppressed of the world should unite themselves. Now he had no intention of doing that, but people were attracted to this and saw it as a language of struggle. And actually, it's also incredibly important to be aware of in the context of, say, Britain, the Islamophobia that is directed by the right against people who identify as Islamists or are identified as Islamists, and who are demonized and face all sorts of repression. So it's very, I think, as socialists, it's incredibly important that we stand up and show our solidarity with people against the oppression of the state. And this is the key question, is
Ton of
really
time as well.
uh,
Sorry, thank you.
where is the question about where do you stand in relation to state power? We should have an implacable hostility to state power, any state, our own state first and foremost, but any other state. That's the spirit that needs to be cultivated. I just want to finish with a quote actually, which I thought I would read to you. And it's from around 1907. It's actually Cecil A. Spring Rice, who was Britain's consul in Tehran. And he was writing in response to a previous Iranian revolution, which was the constitutional revolution, began in 1906. Iranians were demanding a more democratic form of government. And he said, remember, this is 1907, rather a long time before we had the extension of the franchise in Britain to wide layers of the population, including to women. He said, in every town there is an independent assembly which acts without consulting the governor or the Central Assembly in Tehran. One after another, unpopular governors have been expelled, and the central government have found themselves powerless to resist. The danger of universal disorganization seems a real one. A spirit of resistance to oppression and even to all authority is spreading throughout the country. The leaders are unknown. Now, that to me sums up the panic and fear that imperialists and dictators feel when they see the power of ordinary people organizing themselves. There's a lot we could learn from the spirit of that revolution, and I believe that that spirit is still alive in Iran today.